Charlotte Bronte is one of the world's most formidable writers. By her death at age 38, she wrote several books and hundreds of poems, including, of course, Jane Eyre, her most famous book, and your host's top 3 favorite books of all time. Charlotte, in addition to being a force in her own right, was also a part of a family of literary titans. Today, Spencer Clavin and I will be discussing this figure in our continuing Thinker of the Month series. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless in the Julie Hartman YouTube channel in general, where we have a lot of content. As a reminder, every Monday you can catch my show with Dennis Prager, Dennis and Julie. That's at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. And of course, Timeless is Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays at that same time. And you can listen to these on Apple and Spotify afterwards if you would prefer to listen and not see my face. I love the Thinker of the Month series. I think it's our 4th month, so we're already a third into the year of the starting Thinker of the Month series that we are going to keep doing. And this is a DEI episode because we're doing a woman for the first time in these 4 months. We started with Nietzsche, then we did Marx, then we did Dostoevsky, and now we're doing one of my favorite authors, Charlotte Bronte. As always, I am so thrilled to welcome Spencer Clavin to the show. Thank you, Sean. Sean is a big Spencer Clavin fan, as am I. Spencer Clavin is an associate editor at the Claremont Review of Books, and he is the author of one of my other top favorite books of all time, How to Save the West. Spencer, welcome back.
Julie, it's such a pleasure to be here. We are doing the work. We've got female authors here. We're going to talk about sexism and oppression. No, it's actually cool that you said that, besides the fact that it cracked me. I genuinely cracked up at that. But, this is sort of, if you like, the conservative version of diversity, which is to say that I truly believe there really only are 2 flavors of human being, male and female, and that they actually are different. It's worth talking about both sides of that. And this is one of the great novelists of really the English language. So well worth talking about in her own right, not, in fact, a diversity hire.
You forgot to snap doing the work, as you said.
I almost had the clap emojis. If you could animate those around me, that would be amazing.
We're gonna do that. We're gonna do that in post. No, but your point is very well taken. I mean, the problem is when I hear these terms like, oh, we need to bring in female voices, I have such kind of like a Pavlovian allergy to it. But really, there are many wonderful, as we know, female voices, and this effort that we're doing right now should not be cheapened by the woke corruption of some of this language. So I'm so happy to do Charlotte Bronte.
Well, that's one of the most pernicious and I think, frankly, outright evil features of the kind of diversity regime is that because it selects these particular demographics or interest groups and elevates them in this perverse way that they, it is not about merit, but is about identity and these political ideas about, who gets what merits and who gets what, special favors. They create all of this animus, that Pavlovian response you described that makes us think like, I don't want to hear from any women. And that's not true either. It's really difficult to disengage from that, especially now at a moment when, in fact, the DEI regime is becoming really violently anti-woman. I mean, That's a big part of the LGBTQIA trans thing, is that the erasure of real women as a category. And so, ironically, it actually is kind of important right now to elevate women's voices, or whatever, however you want to put it. So I'm glad we're doing it.
Amen, Spencer. Amen. Well, as I said in the introduction, and as this audience knows all too well, because I talk about it every chance I get, Jane Eyre is one of my favorite books of all time. And one of the things I really love about Jane Eyre is that in Jane, Charlotte Bronte presents a protagonist for us to look up to. She's not perfect as an individual. There are times in the novel where I don't think she always handled things maybe as well as she should, but really, for 99% of the time, she has almost pristine character and certainly just the purest of intentions. And so I just want to throw that out there for the audience that, we live in this age of like people celebrating these protagonists that are deeply flawed and are going through trauma, the like Holden Caulfield type having mental breakdown characters. And it really speaks so highly of Charlotte Bronte that she would present such a strong and principled female protagonist as Jane Eyre. Have you read Jane Eyre with all your reading?
Oh yes, I have.
Stupid question. You've read everything.
That's certainly not true. I have not read, for example, Charlotte Bronte's 2 other published and 1 unpublished novels. But I think that would really like count me as a super fan, because I don't think most people just read Jane Eyre. Have you read the other ones?
I have not, but I have ordered them online.
Oh, good. Okay, there you go. But yes, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. Look, the anti-hero, the complicated hero, that's always been a thing. There's always interest in that. But we do seem to have reached a point in art and in culture generally that where we can only elevate people that we find kind of reprehensible or that give us kind of moral qualms. Part of this, I think, has to do with our general lack of understanding of what virtue is, what archetypes are, what models are. And the idea that to portray somebody as virtuous, to show them making good choices, is somehow unrealistic or boring, comes out of this notion that really there's no such thing as the good, that everybody's kind of gray or black and white. And of course, all of that is true. And I think Jane is a very richly detailed and drawn character. She's certainly not, as you say, a cardboard cutout or an imaginary person. But yes, she gives women, especially, somebody to look up to, somebody to follow and sort of consider as a role model, and somebody they can relate to as well. I think one really important feature of this novel is it gives you a strong female character, which is another buzzword, without giving you like a kind of masculinized girl boss. She's not that at all. She's very feminine. I would even, in some instances, call her demure. She's certainly principled, especially in her romantic relationships. And she exudes really a strength. She's the moral center of the novel, certainly, as I'm sure we'll get into talking about, for her in her eventual love affair between her and Edward Rochester. She is the really kind of moral, upstanding pillar of that relationship. So she's certainly strong, but she's not male in any way. She's definitively female, and I think that's part of why, for a lot of women in my life, especially, this is a novel that can just be read again and again and again. It's something to offer every time.
Yes, I love Jane for the reasons that you just said. And I think that's why in recent years, it's been interesting to observe some commentators online actually dislike Jane as a protagonist in Jane Eyre as a novel. I was reading an article in anticipation of this interview on Vox, I believe it was. In the title, I should have, see, if I were a good host and I prepared, I would print it out and read it to you. I actually intended to, but I forgot. In the title was like, Jane Eyre is whiny and self-righteous, and that's why the people hate her. And it's like, my gosh, it's a total inversion. I mean, please chime in if you disagree with me. I think she is the opposite of whiny, the opposite of self-righteous in the book. She's always trying to fit her choices into a broader, I think, deeply Judeo-Christian worldview of objective moral standards that she knows she ought to follow. So it's the more feminine and the more principled a lot of these characters are nowadays, they're seen as traditional, antiquated, conservative, old America women, and they're vilified.
Yeah, I mean, whenever somebody writes an article like that, like, here is why people hate Jane Eyre. I'm like, who hates Jane Eyre? I've literally never met anybody that hates this person. I mean, as I say, girls and women especially seem to really love her. I certainly find her enormously appealing as a person. And one of the things that makes that critique in particular, I think, so mistaken is that Bronte goes out of her way to provide us with examples of actual self-righteousness. I mean, she's not somebody that is uncritical of all forms of religion. In her own life, she had a lot of concerns about the Catholic Church. She herself was raised in an Anglican context. And, in the person, for example, of St. John Rivers, in Helen Burns, we get these images of people who take their kind of principles so far that they're almost not of this world. And one of the main themes of the novel, I suspect, is that, Jane has to seek the good, seek God, seek to honor God, even without becoming kind of holier than thou and too pious. And it's in her kind of engagement with the world and her eventual marriage and that struggle to really embody these principles that she becomes who she is. So she's not self-righteous at all. In fact, she is the alternative to self-righteousness in the novel itself.
Absolutely. There's a great line in the book where Helen Burns, who's one of Jane Eyre's early friends at the first orphanage or school that Jane is at, and Helen encourages Jane to not indulge in resentment. I think it's said avoid the indulgence of resentment. And I loved that idea of, because I mean we see it so much today in 2023 of resentment being an indulgence. But to your point, Spencer, Charlotte Bronte, in showing many of these other characters who are deeply religious, as you argued very well, kind of not even of this world, deeply religious. I think Charlotte Bronte is also showing, you know what? There's an indulgence of resentment, but there's also an indulgence of stoicism. Anything in life taken to an extreme can be an indulgence. So as much as I would love to talk about Jane Eyre the whole time, and we're going to come back to it. There's no way we're not. Let's go to this author, Charlotte Bronte. Clearly, this woman, and for those who are listening who have read her, you know this to be true, I would imagine. And those of you who are listening who have not read her, take my word for it. She is an astoundingly wise individual. Who was Charlotte Bronte? How did she get that wisdom?
Well, the first thing I have to talk about to answer that question is how we say her name. This was a total surprise to me when I was thinking about it. So it turns out that both are basically correct, Bronte and Bronte, which is sort of weird in and of itself. But the reason for this is that the name is kind of a creation. Her father's name, that is the name she took from her father, was initially possibly Brunty. There have been different versions of it, but something with ending with a Y. And so people think that maybe he changed it to Bronte to make it feel a little bit more fancy. But the E might, with that umlaut at the end, might be kind of like Zoe. The Bronte is sort of that idea kind of comes out of her father's background. Bronte also, plenty of people say, so it's not totally clear. But that speaks, I think, to this kind of socially mobile dimension of her family. Her dad came from poverty, ended up an Anglican clergyman, and together with Charlotte's mother, they ended up building, it wouldn't be wrong to call it a middle-class life. That's kind of an anachronistic way of thinking about it, but certainly an industrious and upwardly mobile life. And all throughout their childhoods, these kids, there were many of them, although several of them died, and we end up with three surviving Bronte sisters and one brother. They were all, I think, schooled in a certain degree of self-reliance, a certain degree of piety and industry. That was those were the values that seemed to have prevailed in their household. They were fantastically informed and educated as kids. Their father paid a lot of attention to their education, eventually ended up sending them away to a boarding school, which was an incredibly painful experience for them. It shows up, I think, in Jane Eyre, this sort of abusive situation, but they were also, really well taught and trained in this kind of 19th century English way. They lived in Yorkshire, which is an area to the northeast of England, and they lived famously on the moors, which is this incredibly romantic landscape. And all three of the sisters that survived to adulthood, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, they all wrote and they all drew an enormous amount of inspiration from this kind of windswept English countryside near to the coast. And so I think in part as a result of her Anglican upbringing, and then also in some ways through her suffering and struggles, through the fact that she had to carve out a place for herself in this world that could be very harsh, that she didn't get to just immediately accept from her elders everything that she was taught, and in fact that she didn't succeed in all of the most obvious ways early on in life. She had to kind of turn over every stone in order to ultimately find her way, and that includes failing to publish her first novel, The Professor, which was rejected before Jane Eyre. Actually, technically, her second novel got published and received all of this acclaim. She married relatively late in life. All of these things, I think, are reflected in the way that Jane Eyre is structured. I almost think of this as like the female David Copperfield. If you've read the Charles Dickens novel, David Copperfield is this. It's got a plot. There's something that happens at the core of it, but it's also expansive. It's a kind of sprawling and innovative presentation of this, inner life of a woman that really has to kind of make her own way, even despite having, a great deal of kind of governance and attention and care paid to her. It's that combination, I think, of the Anglican upbringing with just a sort of a wandering life that leads ultimately to a form of success.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to do Charlotte Bronte today was because I didn't really know so much about her, but this is really interesting, and it makes a lot of sense that Charlotte Bronte's life had a lot of difficulty and wandering, as you say, because it's exactly as you pointed out. That's really the novel of Jane Eyre. And, just to give a quick synopsis of Jane Eyre, Jane Eyre is the beginning of the book. She's 10 years old. She's living with her evil aunt and her cousins who hate her and treat her terribly because her parents have died. She goes on to an orphanage because they kick her out of the house. And there, she likes it there, but it's certainly an austere, difficult place to live. Then she becomes essentially a governess and falls in love with her boss. That is also not an easy time, although she does find love, but there's a situation in that house which I don't want to give away, but there's a lot of
thinking we have to avoid spoilers in this episode.
I know, it's so hard. I don't want to spoil it, but anyone can Google it. There's a difficult situation, and then she has to leave the love of her life. She literally almost dies wandering through the forest, goes and shacks up with some people who end up being her cousins, and then the end of the book, I think people know, she thankfully does come back together with Mr. Rochester. But you're so right. I mean, the whole book is wandering and difficulty, and what I really appreciated about Jane throughout the book was that there was never this woe is me, contrary to what Vox would say. There was never this like woe is me. She didn't indulge resentment, to bring up that line. And Jane had this kind of stoic, not in an indulgent sense, but truly in an appropriate way, stoic perseverance and resilience, which seems to have been really the modus operandi of the author.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, there are some accounts after Charlotte became famous. All three of her sisters initially wrote under male pseudonyms, and that was not because women couldn't publish at the time, but because they worried about getting kind of condescended to in the press. They wanted to be taken seriously on their own merits, which I think actually reflects a certain degree of courage. Even though they concealed their names, they wanted to be evaluated without that kind of condescension of the soft condescension of being kind of treated as a footnote, and so they picked these pseudonyms: Currer Bell, Ellis Bell, and Acton Bell, that kind of corresponded to their initials. And eventually, pretty early on, actually, they sort of revealed who they were, and then Charlotte especially became very celebrated in English literary society. So she was famous, essentially. But there are interesting accounts, when, for instance, she visited the famous writer Thackeray. Thackeray's daughter sort of described that she was kind of disappointing, boring. Like this, she didn't really have much to say.
Wow, Charlotte was?
Wonder. Yeah, isn't that amazing? And I sort of wonder whether part of that has to do with the deep interiority that we see in Jane as well. That this was not a flashy or a showy person. This wasn't somebody that immediately needed her name on the novel. This was somebody that actually just kept her own counsel and would sort of mull and reflect on what was going on around her. She was a tiny woman. She was less than 5 feet tall. So, just altogether kind of this very inward person, but obviously a person of enormous resilience and strength as well. And it's a very difficult task, I think, to get that kind of character across in novels. I mean,
Yeah.
people make all of these weird accusations about male novelists. They don't write good female characters, but I actually wonder whether female strength is sort of more difficult or less conducive to artistic portrayal, because it does have this reserve and this interiority. Of course, that's another important reason why Jane Eyre's first person narration is kind of innovative and consequential. I'm not sure if it was the first novel written from a first person female perspective, but it was very unusual to do that. And the kind of way that novel unfolds from Jane's perspective, gives you her thoughts, I think is a big part of how Charlotte gets her own attitudes across, but also, of course, Jane's sort of indelible character.
You're right. That is a very hard thing to accomplish, to convey, but she does do it very well. So I read that Charlotte Bronte, growing up with her brother, created these like little fairy tale books, like physical tiny books, and she would create this magical world. Can you tell me a bit about that? It just kind of fascinated me because Jane Eyre clearly, I think, is a magical book, but it's not magical in the sense of kind of supernatural and otherworldly and fairyland. But clearly Charlotte Bronte loved doing that.
Yeah, Glasstown, it was called, which I just find so entertaining. This is what is known in sort of literary circles as a paracosm, which is a great word, first of all, because it makes you sound smart at cocktail parties, but second of all, because it has all sorts of applications in our modern fiction. Para in Greek means beside or along, and cosmos is our word for cosmos. It's a universe. And so all of these fictional universes, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Harry Potter universe, arguably all paracosms, and Glasstown is one. She and her brother Branwell kind of collaborated on a lot of this, and they would write not only fiction, as you say, prose, but poetry too. Another kind of technical literary term to know here is the term juvenilia, which is a Latin word just meaning kind of like young stuff, things that people get interested in after you become famous. They start to say, oh, when they were little, they worked on this stuff. And so this is not, the height of what any of the Brontes were capable of at a literary level. But it is a fascinating kind of insight window into the world that they must have lived in. I mean, if you think about these are kids that are being told to go out and play basically with nothing except their imagination in this very dramatic landscape. And obviously that has an effect on them. There's no like scrolling on your smartphone. There's no sitting down to watch TV. There's just the natural world and this kind of universe, imaginary universe. Bronte obviously looked back with a lot of fondness on this. She wrote about it in her adult poetry as well. And when her sister Anne died, she wrote a very moving, short little 4-stanza poem that kind of conveys how, when Anne passed, I think a part of her past as well. She sort of lost some connection to that childhood life. She'd already lost several sisters, and to lose Anne was a great blow to her. But yeah, you see in Glasstown and in the early poems this incredibly precocious, but also just fertile imagination, which is kind of cool to get a window into.
I'm sure the best writers have had kind of their version of Ghost Town. They indulged at some time, gosh, I keep using that word, sometime in their life, this fascination with the supernatural. And I'm sure that has made them even better writers. So
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think there's a certain, you talk about that interiority again. There's a certain comfort with solitude, or at least with one's own kind of inner world, that definitely leads to a lot of rich fiction.
it is obvious to us because we've been talking for the past 20 minutes about how great Jane Eyre is. But to ask an obvious question, but arguably the most important question of the episode, Why do you think Charlotte Bronte is one of the most formidable writers? What is it about her that makes her different? And why should people who maybe are listening who haven't read her spend their time on this writer?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I mean, as you say, we've mentioned a number of the kind of axes along which this novel works. And one of the things I think that's great about it is just it's one of those books that every time you reread it, it kind of gives you more. And I think the reason for that is, Bronte was very innovative stylistically. She combined a lot of different formats and genres. There's elements of like Gothic novels here, but there's also obviously high romance, and there's even, autobiography kind of mixed in there. But through it all, what she really is giving you is the portrait of a soul. She's not. It's true that there's a plot, as we mentioned. It's true that there are all sorts of themes that you can identify. But it's not a didactic novel in any sense. She really is drawing a human character, and she gives us a really, I think, profound look into the way that Providence operates in a person's life. She, again, I don't want to spoil anything, but there is a sort of supernatural moment at a pivotal point at the end of the novel, and it's never really explained, but it's clear that there's more design here than is being shown. It's a very difficult literary effect, I think, to tell a carefully crafted story that nevertheless isn't crafted by the characters. As in, the people in this book don't set out to accomplish everything and to wrap everything up morally, and yet the moral universe is kind of almost a character in the novel. At this point, I have to credit my sister Faith Moore, who's another brilliant writer in her own right, and this is her favorite novel. So you guys share that. She wrote a piece called "One Flesh, New Life" at American Mind, which is where I am an editor, and she pointed out that there is this really interesting kind of religious argument being made throughout the entire novel that you don't even, it's never stated outright. You have to kind of look at it again and again to find it, but it really is, without preaching, without ever delivering a sermon, this book is a kind of lived theological allegory. It's about how we find God in the kind of messy and seemingly random and very definitively imperfect events of one human life. And by giving us that in Jane, I think she just showed us something that it's like Jane almost becomes more real than real people. Like, once you've read this novel, she sort of lives with you, and that's a tremendous accomplishment for any novelist, and certainly I think for somebody that, as we've been discussing, is really giving you a woman. She's giving you a feminine character, who nevertheless just like we cannot escape, and whom we love from the first page.
As if I didn't already love the Clavin family, hearing that your sister's favorite book is Jane Eyre. By the way, I want to tell the audience that I'll be interviewing Faith on this show soon. So we're probably going to see some Jane Eyre discussion in that episode. Of course, we'll be talking about Faith's new novel. Before we continue with our discussion of Charlotte Bronte, I'd like to quickly tell you about MyPillow. I use many MyPillow products. I walk in every day wearing my slippers to work. I sleep on the MyPillow and the Giza Dream bed sheets, and I use my towels. And you can get those things at a discount if you use the promo code Hartman, which is my last name spelled Hartman. For a limited time, you'll get 60% off of the Giza Dream bed sheets. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll get a set for as low as $39.99 with the promo code Hartman. Just go to MyPillow.com and click on the radio listener square, or call 1-800-566-6745, and you guessed it, use the promo code Hartman to get discounts on many MyPillow products. I know I said it at the outset, but I want to reiterate that I use these products. I really do enjoy them, and I wouldn't tell you about them and advertise them if I didn't use them. Back to Charlotte Bronte. Actually, let's pivot for a moment and talk about Emily Bronte. Maybe we'll have to do a separate Timeless Thinker of the Month episode about Emily. But, and by the way, I forgot Rousseau when I was listing. We're actually on our 5th month of Thinker of the Month right now. Nietzsche, Marx, Rousseau, Dostoevsky, and now we have the DEI episode. To further the DEI discussion, so Emily Bronte was Charlotte's sister. She is the author of Wuthering Heights.
Hmm.
one of the great English novels. And so, I mean, I guess this is the perfect question to ask you as a member of a family where it seems like everyone is a superstar, especially a literary and intellectual superstar. What do you think it was about that family that produced two of these writers? And in what ways is Emily different from Charlotte? In what ways are they the same or similar?
Well, I'm very flattered by the framing of that question, I have to say, and modesty demands that I move past it and just answer your question about the Brontes. It's quite possible, actually, that you could say this family produced three great writers. Anne Bronte, the least known of the three, wrote a novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And there's actually kind of some like drama or some tea to spill here, which is controversial, difficult to get into. Um, After Anne died, I mentioned that Charlotte wrote a beautiful poem, sort of mourning her loss. But she also then became the executor of Anne's literary estate. And in doing so, she suppressed the republication of Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And it's possible that by doing that, she sort of took it out of circulation long enough that it never quite got the head of steam that the other two novels did. And it might be that that's why we don't mention it in the same breath as Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. In which case, this could be kind of an act of jealousy on Charlotte's part. It might also, Charlotte herself said it was to protect her sister from the press, which after they found out that Charlotte was a woman, that these sisters were women, they did make a number of accusations, kind of silly accusations against them, that Jane Eyre was crude, that it indulged in topics that women shouldn't talk or think about. And so, that might have been an act of protection on Charlotte's part. Either way, you're right. I mean, what is in the water in the Yorkshire moors that is causing these people to produce this kind of literary output? My answer here, and it does actually come out of my own family experience, is that like culture really matters, and it matters not just at the level of the city or the town or the country, but also at the level of the family unit. In fact, in some ways, the family unit is the basic unit of culture, and this is not just true in terms of literature. It's true really in terms of morality and ethics, outlook, worldview. We're social animals, and the things that people around us are doing have an effect on us. Obviously, talent plays a role here. There must have been some innate features of all of these sisters' gifts, but growing up within the church, which prized and valued literary gifts and was able to nurture them, getting afforded a serious education that, for all of its difficulties, nevertheless, took the literary arts seriously and didn't just reduce them to kind of a plaything, as our literary education often now does. I think that's the kind of environment you need to foster excellence. And I think that these sisters kind of are, among other things, they're a testimony to the fact that if you surround yourself with people who can cultivate your gifts, can bring out the best in you, and if you make your family into that kind of network, you're much more likely than anybody in another context to produce greatness. Other than that, talent is blind. Who can say where it falls? But I really do think, in this context, like culture matters, family matters, and the way that we're raised has a profound effect on us.
Were they similar as writers in the themes that they explored, perhaps in the style?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we don't have a ton of data to go on here because we've got these sort of three major novels for each of them, and then the other novels that Charlotte wrote. They're concerned and interested in similar themes. They're all interested in the moors. They all found that setting very moving and evocative. And if you think about the kind of concerns of the Romantic era, the capital R Romantic period, we haven't talked that much about their sort of their context, their historical context more broadly in terms of like literary periods. But this is a moment of deep concern with the natural world, with the sort of spirits or the emotional flavor that comes out of the natural world and the communion between the human soul and its environment. So they've kind of had that going for them too, that they were right literally out their doorstep, there was a kind of ready-made source of inspiration for them. The Moors feature very prominently in Wuthering Heights, and I definitely think that romance, desire, love, the right way to desire and to love somebody is a concern for all the Brontes, as indeed it would have been for any woman of the time, or any person, man or woman of the time. But certainly, the question, the tension between the passions and social expectations on the one hand, then virtue and moral absolutes on the other hand. These are kind of perennial themes, but they become very acute in all of these novels. It's kind of one of the central human concerns. I have these desires. They pull me in various directions, but I also have to contend with my responsibilities, my obligations to my fellow man, and my obligations to God. For my money, Charlotte gets that best with the central plot of Jane Eyre. I think that it's kind of unsurpassed in the way that it manages to dramatize that. But Wuthering Heights is obviously also about it, and it was it's one of the great themes of literature.
What I love about Charlotte Bronte, and obviously I've read Jane Eyre, I've read several of her poems. I haven't read any of Emily, though I did order Wuthering Heights, is that it seems, in addition to these writers being very wise and introspective, as we've been talking about, they're very principled. And I think the Bible is of course riveting, but some people may sort of want to get all of the moral instruction of the Bible, but without having to read the Bible. And I feel like what's so great about Jane Eyre, and again, some of the poems, is that it's basically Judeo-Christian values in a fiction book. And it's taking these situations that many of us find ourselves in, if not the exact moments of Jane Eyre, but similar moments, and gives us a little bit of a guidebook of how we might be able to react to those things in a again, principled way.
That's a really great point. Well put. It speaks to one of my favorite themes, which is the moral dimension of art. You and I were kind of born into a world that had inherited this very weird idea. It comes out of the last century or so, that morality and art have nothing to do with one another. That if you are trying to convey a moral message, if you have kind of preconceived moral notions, then you're not going to be as honest or as true an artist as you would be otherwise. And this sounds like a kind of reasonable thing to us because it's so deeply embedded into our really quite parochial culture and time and place. But actually, it's an extremely unusual way of looking at art. The much more ancient way of looking at art is to say, well, yeah, of course, a story teaches us in different ways than a speech or a treatise would. But it still teaches us. And how can it not? There's no way that we can watch human beings do things, which is effectively what fiction is, or watch a human soul express a feeling and have some kind of reaction to it, whether we think like, yes, go into the basement, or no, don't go into the basement, or don't go in the, whatever we're saying to the character, we are, there's a natural response, a moral or an ethical response that is drawn out of us. And as you say, that is why Jane Eyre is such an invaluable novel, is because it gives this picture of somebody who is not perfect, is not imaginary in that, or at least is not a caricature. Obviously, she's not a real person, but she's not a caricature. She's not an archetype. She's a very recognizable human being, and yet she shows us rather than tells us what it is to seek virtue in even the smallest of things. So for that, I mean, we just have we can never be grateful enough, I think, to Bronte.
Yes, and as you just said, if there's one takeaway of Jane Eyre, it's don't go in the attic.
Don't go in the attic. Yeah, exactly.
We'll leave it at that. Spencer, thank you so much for coming on, and I'll see you next time. It'll be number 6, half a year into this, and may there be many more.
Absolutely. Cheers to that. Thanks, Julie, as always. It's been such a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all of you, of course, for joining me. As a reminder, please hit the subscribe button down below if you like what you see here and would like to stay notified. And you can email me at julie@julie-hartman.com anytime. I'll see you soon. Take care.